year was 2024. The month was October. The air over Black Hawk County, Iowa carried the smell of diesel fuel and drying corn, the way it had every fall for as long as anyone alive could remember. A Peterbilt 389 chrome shining blue paint, catching the late afternoon sun, pulled onto the inbound scale at the Crandall Grain Cooperative. The truck groaned to a stop. The air brakes hissed once, a long, tired sigh. The kind of sigh a man makes when he has been on his feet too long. Inside the cab sat a man named Burl Maddox. He was 70 years old. His hands were thick with the lifetime of gripping a steering wheel. The knuckles knotted, the calluses smooth as riverstone. His hair had gone white sometime around the millennium. His face was the color of saddle leather. He had driven this same route for 40 years. He knew every crack in the pavement, every dip in the road between the Pollard place and the elevator, every section of fence where deer crossed at dusk. A young woman slid open the window of the scale house. She smiled at him. It was a real smile, not the kind they teach you to put on at corporate orientations. Her name was Lorene Crandall, though everyone in the office called her Ren. She handed him the scale ticket through the window. Burl took it the way he had taken 10,000 scale tickets before. Gross weight, tare weight, net bushels, moisture content 15.6%. Good corn. Honest corn. Then his eyes drifted up to the top of the ticket, where the company name was printed in plain black letters. Crandall Grain Cooperative. And below that, in slightly smaller print, 3 words that did something to his chest he had not expected. Owner, Walter Crandall. Burl Maddox stopped breathing for a moment. He just stopped. The breath caught somewhere behind his sternum and would not go anywhere. He had seen the name on the sign out front. It was painted 50 feet tall on the side of the new grain leg. It was stitched onto the hats of every man who swept the pit. But seeing it here on this little piece of yellow paper in his own thick hand, it was a different thing entirely. It was the kind of seeing that goes through a man. Ren tilted her head. She asked him if everything was all right. Her voice was soft. She had her uncle's eyes. Burl did not answer right away. He looked past her into the office through the doorway behind the window, all the way to the far wall. Mounted on a length of weathered barnwood was a steering wheel. Old, black. The plastic cracked and faded by sunlight. He knew that steering wheel. He had seen it new. He had seen it covered in a young man's bleeding knuckles. He cleared his throat and said the only thing a man can say at a moment like that. He said it was nothing. He said it was just a long memory. Burl Maddox was a good man. He had coached Little League for 20 years. He had served on the church board at St. Mark's Lutheran in Cedar Falls. He was the kind of man who would never intentionally hurt another human being, which was exactly why sitting there in his cab with the engine ticking down, he could not stop remembering the autumn of 1984. The day he had looked a 19-year-old kid with that very same last name straight in the eyes and told him no. Let me take you back. The year was 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. A gallon of gas cost $1.15. The Corn Belt was bleeding farmers like a wound that would not close. Banks were calling in loans across the Midwest, the way wolves call across a frozen plain. And in Black Hawk County, Iowa, on 160 acres of black bottom land that had been broken by a man named Lemuel Crandall. In 1898, a young man stood alone in the middle of his cornfield and tried to figure out how he was going to survive. His name was Walter Crandall. Everyone called him Walt. He was 19 years old. He stood 5'10" in his work boots and weighed 160 pounds with his coat on. His eyes were the same gray as his grandfather's eyes. the same gray as the November sky over the Cedar River. His hands were already old. They had been old since he was 6 years old, since the spring his parents died on a patch of black ice on County Road 7, coming home from a wedding in 1971. He had been raised after that morning by people who taught him by example. And the example was that grief did not stop the chores. His grandparents had taken him in without ceremony. They had simply made room. His grandfather, Elias Crandall, was 60 years old when the boy came to live with them, and tougher than rope. His grandmother, Hattie, was a woman who had baked bread for the Methodist church suppers for 40 years and never raised her voice once. The boy slept in the upstairs bedroom that had once belonged to his father. He grew up on that farm. He learned to drive a tractor at 11. He learned to shoot at 12. He learned to grieve at 6. And he learned to keep grieving quiet. In May of 1984, Elias Crandall walked out into the South 40 to check the new corn. He was 3 rows in when his heart simply stopped. The doctor at the Cedar Falls Hospital said it had been the kind of stop that you could not have predicted and could not have prevented. He told Walt his grandfather had probably not even known what was happening. Walt nodded and said thank you and went out to the parking lot and stood beside his grandfather's old pickup truck and put his hand flat on the hood and did not move for almost an hour. Hattie Crandall held on through the summer. She made meals. She tended the kitchen garden. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and read her Bible. But anyone with eyes could see that something inside her had gone out the same day as Elias. In late September, on a Wednesday morning, Walt found her in her chair by the window, with her tea gone cold beside her. The undertaker said her heart had simply followed her husband. They put her in the ground next to him in the small cemetery on the hill behind St. Mark's. The whole town came. Walt stood by the grave in his grandfather's funeral suite, the one Hattie had taken in at the shoulders for him, and he did not cry where anyone could see. After that, the farm was his. The land was paid for. That was the great gift his grandfather had left him. 160 acres of clear deeded ground free of any mortgage, with a deed signed and notarized and locked in a lockbox at the First National Bank of Waterloo. There was the old farmhouse with the wraparound porch and the sloping back kitchen. There was the equipment shed his great-grandfather had built in 1922 out of timbers cut from the property. There was an International 806 tractor from 1967 that had 300,000 hours on the clock and ran like it had 100. There was a combine from the early 60s that was held together with promises and 2 new bearings. And there was in a metal lockbox under the kitchen buffet $2,650 in cash. That was every dollar of operating money the farm had in the world. Walt did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. He worked from before sunup until after the moon was high. He fueled the 806 himself. He greased every fitting on the combine. He patched the tires. He drove fence and fixed gates. And in early October, when the corn turned hard and the husks went brown and the moisture came down to where it needed to be, he climbed up into that old combine and he ran 16-hour days for 2 weeks straight. He came in at night with his eyes red-rimmed and his back screaming, and he heated up whatever was in the icebox, and he slept in his clothes more nights than not. But he got the crop out. 8,200 bushels of yellow number 2 corn. Not a record by any stretch, but honest, real, his. Enough to pay the property taxes due in November. Enough to buy seed for 1985. Enough to prove to nobody but himself that he could do it. The corn sat in the wagons. It sat in the small, dented, galvanized bin behind the equipment shed. He needed to get it to the elevator in town. The 806 was a tractor, not a truck. He had no semi. He had no grain truck of any kind. He had to hire a hauler. There was only one man in the county whose name came up when serious farmers needed serious work done. Burl Maddox, 30 years old, cabover Freightliner. On time every time, reliable as the sunrise. Walt picked up the phone in the kitchen and called him. In the autumn of 1984, Burl Maddox was a young man on the rise. He had grown up on a small farm outside Waverly, but he had never wanted the dirt. He had wanted the road. He had bought his first truck at 22 with a Kyo-signed loan from his uncle. By 30, he was on his third truck, a brand new Freightliner cabover white and gleaming, the kind of truck that turned heads in any small town diner parking lot. He hauled for the biggest operations in the county. He hauled for Raymond Pollard, who farmed 1,200 acres and drove a Cadillac. He hauled for the McAllister brothers, who ran a feedlot up in Bremer County. He had built a name for himself by being efficient and honest and always available, and he was not about to throw that name away. He pulled into the Crandall farm lane on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. The sun was low. The poplars by the drainage ditch had gone yellow. He stepped down from the cab in clean Wrangler jeans and a flannel shirt that still had the creases from where it had been folded on the shelf at the JCPenney. He had a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand. Raymond Pollard had given it to him an hour earlier at the big farm 2 miles east. The cup said, Pollard Brothers Seed in green letters on the side. Burl looked around. He saw the old 806 tractor. He saw the small bin. He saw the 6-inch auger leaning against the side of the shed. He saw a grain cart that could not have held more than 250 bushels at full capacity. And he saw Walt, 19 years old but looking 16, skinny, tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep. Dirt under his fingernails, a streak of grease on his jaw he had not noticed yet. Burl was a kind man. That was the thing. He really was. He walked over and put a hand on Walt's shoulder. He said, "Son, you have done good work here." He said it sounded like a fine crop. Walt nodded. He said, "Thank you, Mr. Maddox." And then Burl took a long, slow breath, the way a man does when he is about to say a thing he does not want to say. He looked at the 806. He looked at the tiny auger. He looked at the grain cart that would take a full hour to fill his trailer. And he gave Walt the kindest, gentlest, most well-intentioned no that any man has ever given another. He said he could not do it. He said it was not the money. He said the money was fine. He said it was the time. His truck did not make money sitting still. That little auger of Walt's would have him parked in the driveway for an hour to fill one trailer load. He had 3 other farmers waiting on him that very afternoon. Big operations, modern setups, grain legs that could fill his truck in 8 minutes flat. If he was late for them, he lost their business. Not just for the day, for good. He said it was not personal. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes is true. He looked Walt straight in the eye, and he did the thing that 4 decades later he would still be unable to forgive himself for. He smiled a small, sad, fatherly smile, and he said, "You are just a kid. You have got a lot to learn. This is one of those lessons." He said he was sorry. He said he wished him the best. Then he turned around and walked back to his truck. He did not look back. The Freightliner started with a low diesel rumble. The air brakes released. He pulled out of the lane in a slow rolling cloud of pale October dust. The dust drifted across the corn stalks and settled on the leaves and was eventually carried away by the evening wind. Walt Crandall stood there alone. He did not cry. He did not curse. He did not even sit down. He stood in the middle of his own yard, with his hands in his pockets, and watched the place where the truck had been. And he listened to the silence come back. Have you ever been told you could not do something not by an enemy, not by a bully, but by a man who genuinely believed he was helping you? By a man who thought he was teaching you a valuable lesson about your own limits, delivered with a hand on your shoulder and a kind tone in his voice. It is the kindest cuts that go the deepest. You cannot fight them with anger. You cannot argue with them. They sit in you like a pebble in a boot, and every step you take, you feel them. If you have ever been on the receiving end of one of those, leave a comment below and let me know. Because what Walt Crandall did next was not born of rage. It was born of something quieter and far more dangerous. It was born of a decision made in the long silence after the dust had settled. He went into the farmhouse. He took off his coat. He hung it on the hook by the back door the way his grandmother had taught him. He stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The house smelled like Hattie's lavender soap, and that smell was almost more than he could bear. He went into the living room. He sat down in his grandfather's chair. He stared at the cold stove until the sun went down behind the hill, and the room went dark, and he had not turned on a single lamp. He made himself a sandwich at some point. He could not have told you what was on it. He sat at the kitchen table and ate it and washed the plate and put it back in the cupboard and went back to the chair. Somewhere around midnight, he climbed the stairs to the upstairs bedroom that had been his father's, and he lay down in his clothes, and he stared at the ceiling for 2 hours, and then he got up. He came back down to the kitchen. He turned on the small lamp over the sink. He went to the bottom drawer of the buffet, the one his grandmother had kept her good linens in. Underneath the linens, in a leather-bound notebook with a cracked spine, was the record of 70 years of Crandall family farming. His grandfather's notebook, the one Elias had carried in the inside pocket of his coat from the day he had taken over from his own father in 1947. Walt brought it to the kitchen table. He sat down. He opened it. The first page was dated April 3rd, 1947. The handwriting was careful, almost delicate, the way a young man writes when he is trying to make a thing last. There were entries about plantings and prices and rainfall. There were sketches of fence repairs. There were lists of what each field had grown for the last 20 years, and what diseases had passed through, and what had worked and what had failed. It was the operating manual of a life. Walt read it slowly. He turned the pages with his rough finger and thumb. He came to a page near the back, dated October 9th, 1979. His grandfather would have been 55 years old when he wrote it. The entry was short. It said simply in his grandfather's spidery hand the words that Walt would carry with him for the next 40 years of his life. Never owe a man his own labor. He read it 3 times. He read it 4 times. His hands started to shake. He set the notebook down on the table and pressed his palms flat against the wood and held them there. He was not going to cry. He had decided that at his grandmother's funeral. He was not going to cry until the work was done. But the kitchen was so quiet, and the house was so empty, and the weight of the day was on him like a wagon load of stones. And at 2:17 in the morning on the 8th of October, 1984, in the kitchen where his grandmother had taught him to make biscuits when he was 7 years old, Walter Crandall put his face in his hands, and he cried the way a man cries when he has been holding it in for too long, the kind of crying that comes from deep in the chest and does not stop until it is good and ready. When it was done, he wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He sat very still for a long time. Then he got up. He put on his coat and his boots. He walked across the yard in the dark to the equipment shed. He pushed open the heavy sliding door. He stepped inside. The shed smelled like motor oil and old straw, and his grandfather's pipe tobacco, faint, ghostly 4 months stale. He walked over to the 806. He put his hand flat on the cold steel hood. He stood there with his hand on that hood for almost 2 full minutes, and he did not say anything to anyone but inside him. In the place where men make the decisions that shape the rest of their lives, something settled. Something hardened. Something turned over like a plow dropping into soil. He was not going to ask anyone for permission again. Not ever. Not for as long as he lived. He was going to figure out how to haul his own corn. And then he was going to figure out how to never need anyone else for anything that the dirt and his own 2 hands could provide. The next morning, he did not call another trucker. He did not even consider it. He poured himself a cup of black coffee. He went to the buffet. He took the lockbox out from under the kitchen buffet, opened it, and counted the money. $2,650. Every dollar the farm had in the world. He put the entire stack in his coat pocket. He got into his grandfather's old pickup truck. The truck was a 1972 Chevrolet C10 with a straight 6 and a cracked windshield. He turned the key. The engine caught on the second try. He pulled out of the lane in the same direction Burl Maddox had gone 20 hours earlier, and he drove. He drove south. He drove for almost 4 hours. He was going to a farm equipment auction outside of Cedar Rapids that he had seen advertised in the Tama County paper. There were going to be tractors there. There were going to be combines. There were going to be the picked over and the unwanted, the trade-ins and the write-offs. He had no idea what he was looking for exactly. He only knew what he was not looking for. He was not looking for anything new. He was not looking for anything bought on time. He was looking for something that was already paid for in spirit, if not in fact by the years of work it had already done. He pulled into the auction grounds at 10:30 in the morning. The lot was crowded with men in seed corn caps and Carhartt coats. He paid $2 for a paddle and walked the rows. He passed the new tractors. He passed the late model combines. He walked all the way to the back of the lot, past the better trucks, past the working trucks, past the trucks a man with money would have considered. He kept walking until he came to the very last row, the row of forgotten things, the row where the auctioneer's voice would carry the least excitement, the row of broken promises and rusted iron. And in that row, the third truck from the end parked at a slight angle. On a pile of flattened cardboard sat a 1968 International Loadstar 1600. Single axle. 250 bushel grain box on the back. The paint had once been red. Now it was the color of dried clay and rust and old blood and time. The fenders had eaten through in 2 places. The driver's door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. The Continental engine, 478 cubic inches, 6 cylinders, had 122 gross horsepower on the day it left the factory, and had probably 80 on its best day now. The tires were cracked. The cab smelled when Walt opened the door and climbed up like 15 years of cold mornings and gas station coffee. He stood beside it for a long time. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the 806. He thought about the way old iron taken care of had no expiration date. And he thought about the price tag that had been tied to the side mirror with a piece of baling wire. The reserve was $3,000. Walt had $2,650. When the auctioneer got to the truck, the bidding started low. Nobody wanted it. A young man in a Pioneer seed cap 2 rows over bid $1,000, and the auctioneer took it because he had to. Then, nothing. The crowd was already thinning. The good stuff had been sold an hour ago. The auctioneer looked at Walt, who had been standing beside the truck for 40 minutes by then, and he said, "Do I have 1,100? Walt raised his paddle. Then 1,200 from the man in the pioneer cap. Then 1,300 from Walt. 1,400. 1,500. The man in the pioneer cap dropped out at 1,600. The auctioneer asked for 17. He asked for 17 3 times. Then he said, "Sold," to the young man in the gray jacket. For $1,600, Walt walked over to the auctioneer's table. He took out the stack of cash from his coat pocket. He counted it onto the table. $1,600 exactly. The auctioneer raised his eyebrows. He had not seen many men pay cash for a 16-year-old grain truck. He gave Walt the title and a receipt. He shook Walt's hand. He said, "Good luck, son." Walt walked back to the truck. He climbed in. He turned the key. The engine cranked for almost 10 seconds before it caught, and when it caught rough with a cloud of blue smoke and a rattle from somewhere down deep that suggested at least one valve was unhappy with its life. Walt let it idle for 10 minutes. He listened. He could hear his grandfather's voice the way Elias had taught him listen to the engine, the way you would listen to a man trying to tell you he is sick. The engine settled. It ran. It would get him home. He stopped at a Texaco station outside Cedar Rapids and put $12 worth of diesel in the tank. He had $244 left to his name, and the next planting season was 6 months away. He climbed back in the cab. He started the long, slow drive north. The Loadstar would not go faster than 45 miles an hour. Every hill was a war. The exhaust manifold had a leak. The cab heater did not work. The wind came in around the door seal and through a hairline crack in the windshield. By the time he pulled into his own farm lane 4 hours later, the sun was already going down. He killed the engine in the yard. He sat in the cab for a moment. He looked at the equipment shed. He looked at the house. He felt something he had not felt since before his grandfather died. He felt that it was finally his. Winter came down hard that year. The first snow fell on the 18th of November. By Thanksgiving, the temperature was below zero at night. By Christmas, the wind off the prairie had teeth. Walt spent every daylight hour and most of the dark ones in the equipment shed. He had run an extension cord out from the house. He had hung a single bare bulb from a rafter. The bulb threw a circle of yellow light maybe 15 feet across, and outside that circle was darkness and cold, and the smell of old hay. He pulled the engine out of the Loadstar piece by piece. He had his grandfather's toolbox. The toolbox was a green metal snap-on chest from the early 50s, and every tool inside it had been sharpened and oiled by Elias Crandall's hands. Walt laid the tools out on a sheet of cardboard the way a surgeon lays out instruments. He worked from his grandfather's notebook. He worked from the Continental engine manual he had ordered from a parts house in Des Moines. He worked from the memory of standing beside his grandfather at 13 and being shown how to set timing. He cleaned every part. He replaced every gasket he could afford to replace. He honed the cylinders by hand with a 3-stone hone he borrowed from a neighbor, and never told the neighbor he had borrowed. He drove an hour each way to a salvage yard outside Dubuque to find a used water pump for $15. He learned the old engine the way a young husband learns a new wife. He learned what it liked and what it did not. He learned where it was tender and where it was strong. His hands took a beating. The cuts started early. By December, his knuckles were a permanent map of small wounds, scabs over scabs, and the cold made them split open every morning. He kept a tube of bag balm on the workbench. He patched himself up the way he patched the engine, without comment, without complaint, with the simple stubbornness of a man who has decided that stopping is not an option. A neighbor named Hap Whitlock came by twice that winter. Hap was 70 years old. He had been a diesel mechanic at the John Deere implement shop in Waterloo for 41 years before he retired. He lived 3/4 of a mile down the gravel road. The first time he came by was a Saturday afternoon in early December. He drove his old Ford pickup into the yard and walked into the shed without knocking. He stood at the edge of the circle of light and watched Walt for almost a full minute without saying anything. Then he pointed at the timing belt and said, "You will want to look at that," and turned around and walked back to his truck and drove away. He came back 2 weeks later with a cardboard box of used parts, gaskets, a fuel filter housing, a rebuilt starter. He set the box on the workbench and did not say anything. Walt looked up. He started to say he could not pay for them. Hap waved his hand the way an old man waves at a fly. He said, "Your grandpa pulled my beans out in the fall of '67. He said it had been the year his barn had burned down in October, and he had thought he was going to lose everything. He said Elias had brought his combine over without being asked and worked 4 straight days and never sent him a bill. He said Elias had told him to pay it forward someday." Hap looked Walt in the eye. He said, "Today is someday." Then he got back in his truck and he drove home. Walt stood in the shed for a long time after Hap left. He put his hands on the workbench. He looked at the box of parts. He thought about his grandfather 4 months in the ground now, and how a man could leave the world and still be working in it, still be reaching across the years to take care of his own. He picked up a gasket. He went back to the engine. January came. February came. The snow piled up against the north side of the shed until the drift was 4 feet deep. Walt kept working. He drank black coffee out of a thermos his grandmother had given his grandfather in 1962. He ate sandwiches he made himself. He listened to the wind. Some nights late, he would put down his wrench and just sit on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and listen to nothing at all, and feel his grandfather very close to him in the silence. On a Saturday morning in the second week of March, the snow began to melt. Water ran down off the roof of the shed in long, thin streams. Walt finished bolting the last of the engine accessories into place. He had been working on the Loadstar for 4 months. He had spent $82 of his $244 on parts. He had spent nothing on labor because there was no labor to pay. He climbed up into the cab. He sat down behind the steering wheel. The black plastic was cold under his hands. He turned the key. The engine cranked. Once, twice. On the 3rd revolution it caught. It did not rattle. It did not smoke. It came up to a low, steady, idle smooth, as water running over stones. The kind of idle that says, "I am ready to work." Walt sat there with his hands on the wheel and listened to it for a long time. Then he put his head down against the back of his hands on the steering wheel and he allowed himself one small private smile. The first smile he had allowed himself since the previous May. He climbed down. He walked to the big sliding door of the shed. He pushed it open. The sun came in. The yard was muddy with melt. He climbed back into the cab. He put the truck in first gear. He let out the clutch, slow. The Loadstar rolled forward out of the shed into the yard, into the spring, into the rest of his life. He drove it down the lane. He drove it out onto County Road 9. He drove a 1/4 mile north and then he turned around and drove back. He pulled into the yard and he killed the engine. The silence afterward felt like a benediction. He had been told he was too much of a risk. He had been told he was just a kid. He had been told to learn his lesson. And all winter long in the cold dark of an empty shed, with a single bare bulb and a leather notebook from 1947, and the ghost of an old man who had loved him. He had taught himself a lesson of his own. The lesson was simple. It would shape every decision he made for the next 40 years of his life. The dirt was enough. If you have ever been told you were too much of a risk by someone who smiled when they said, "Drop a comment below and tell me about it," because the story of Walter Crandall is just getting started. And what he was about to do over the next 24 years would not just change his own life. It would change the lives of every farmer for 50 miles around. And one day it would bring an old man named Burl Maddox right back to the front gate he had once driven away from, hat in his hands with nowhere left to go. Spring of 1985 came to Black Hawk County, the way it always does in eastern Iowa. Slow and muddy, with the smell of wet earth rising up out of every field by the second week of April. Walter Crandall planted his first crop as the sole owner of the farm. He planted it the way his grandfather had taught him: corn on the high ground, beans on the low. He worked the 806 tractor from before dawn until after dusk. He drove the planter rows so straight a man could have laid a string along them. When the last seed was in the ground on the second Saturday of May, he climbed down off the tractor and stood at the edge of his own field and looked out at 160 acres of his own black dirt, freshly worked, ready to grow. And he thought of his grandfather. And he did not say anything because there was nothing left to say. The summer was a working summer. He sprayed when he had to spray. He cultivated when he had to cultivate. He fixed fence in the heat of July with the cicadas screaming in the trees. By the end of August, the corn was 12 feet tall, and the beans were ankle deep with pods. By the end of September, the fields had begun to turn, and by the second week of October, on a clear Tuesday morning with frost still on the ground, Walt Crandall climbed into the cab of his old combine and started cutting his own crop for the second harvest in a row. He cut for 11 days. The yields were not record yields, but they were honest yields. 8,700 bushels of corn, 2,200 bushels of beans. He augered the corn into the same dented, galvanized bin behind the equipment shed where he had stored last year's crop. The bin would not hold all of it. He had to start hauling. That was the first time in October of 1985 that Walt Crandall pulled the Loadstar out of its shed and drove it to the elevator with 250 bushels of his own corn in the bed. The drive into town took 22 minutes. The elevator was the only one in the county. It sat on the rail spur at the edge of Cedar Falls. The line of trucks waiting to dump that morning stretched halfway down the road. Walt fell in at the back. He sat in the cab with the heater on and the radio off. The trucks ahead of him were tractor-trailers, semis, the big rigs of the big operations. Pollard Brothers had 3 trucks in line. The McAllister brothers had 2. There were Mack and Peterbilt and Kenworth and Freightliner trucks, and somewhere up ahead, Walt could see the white roof of Burl Maddox's cabover Freightliner sticking up above the others. A man in the truck behind him, a hauler Walt did not recognize, leaned out his window and looked down at the Loadstar and laughed. He shook his head. He called over to one of the other drivers, a man waiting on the shoulder, and pointed at Walt's truck and said something Walt could not quite hear, but could plainly understand. They both laughed. Walt sat very still in the cab. He kept both hands on the steering wheel. He watched the line move forward 6 feet. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the leather notebook in the kitchen drawer at home. He did not look at the men. He did not roll down his window. He just waited his turn. It took him 40 minutes to get to the pit. The pit man was a high schooler named Donnie Vandermeer, who had not yet learned to keep his face flat. Donnie looked at the truck. He looked at Walt. He waved him forward and dumped the load and waved him out. The whole thing took 8 minutes from gate to gate. Walt drove home. He loaded another 250 bushels. He drove back. He waited again. He dumped again. He drove home again. He made 33 trips that fall. Each trip was a meditation. Each trip was a small piece of independence purchased with patience. The math of the thing was something Walt had worked out on a piece of yellow legal pad at the kitchen table the week before harvest. If he had hired a hauler at the going rate of 18 cents a bushel, the season would have cost him $1,560. His own diesel and oil and wear came out to $112 a load when you spread it over the season, which was about $14 a trip, $4.40 a bushel, less than the haulers charged. Times 33 trips, that was $132 saved. It was a small number. He knew it was a small number, but it was a number that had not existed before. It was a number he had created with his own 2 hands in a cold shed during a cold winter, and it would have a use. The use came the first week of December. The Hendricks farm sat 8 miles south of the Crandall place, 80 acres of decent ground that had belonged to a man named Vernon Hendricks, until Vernon had bought a new combine in 1981, with money he did not have and could not pay back. The bank had foreclosed in November. The auction was set for the second Tuesday of December. Walt had heard about it at the elevator. The asking price was $48,000. The land was good. The bank wanted it gone before Christmas. Walt drove into Cedar Falls on a Friday afternoon. He went to the First National Bank of Black Hawk County. He asked at the front desk to see the bank president, a man named Merrill Sandover. Sandover was 58 years old, gray at the temples with the kind of face that had said no to a great many farmers over the previous 4 years. Sandover took Walt back into his office. He sat down behind his big oak desk. He folded his hands. He asked Walt what he could do for him. Walt sat in the leather chair across from him. Walt said he wanted to buy the Hendricks place. Sandover nodded slowly. He pulled out a folder. He started to explain the financing options, the loan terms, the down payment requirements, the way the bank could work with a young farmer who had collateral. Walt let him talk. When Sandover paused, Walt set a battered leather satchel on the desk. He opened it. He turned it around so Sandover could see inside. There were stacks of bills banded with white paper bands from the Cedar Rapids Farmers and Merchants Bank, where Walt had cashed his harvest checks. $48,000 in cash. The whole purchase price. Walt did not say anything. He just looked at Sandover. Sandover looked at the cash. He looked at Walt. He looked at the cash again. He stopped talking about financing. He closed the folder. He stood up and walked around the desk and shook Walt's hand. He said he would draw up the papers that afternoon. The deal closed on the following Monday. Walter Crandall, age 20, walked out of the First National Bank of Black Hawk County, the owner of 240 acres of free and clear ground. 2 miles down the road on that same Monday, Burl Maddox was signing papers of his own. He was upgrading. He was 31 years old and ambitious, and the cabover Freightliner had 87,000 miles on it. And the new conventional Freightliners coming out of the dealership in Des Moines were the most beautiful things on 4 axles a man had ever seen. He took out a loan. The payment was $470 a month for 60 months. He signed his name 3 times. He drove home in his old truck. The new one would be ready for him on Friday. He felt like a man going somewhere. 2 summers passed. Walt farmed the Hendricks ground and his own home place. He hauled his own corn with the Loadstar. He kept his expenses on the back of envelopes, In the summer of 1986, on a Saturday afternoon in late June, he walked into the Tama County Fair to look at heifers, and he saw a young woman standing by the cattle barns holding the end of a lead rope on a Hereford bull calf that did not particularly want to stand still. Her name was Lorene Mae Tuthill. She was 24 years old. She was a registered nurse at the Allen Hospital in Waterloo. She had come to the fair with her younger brother who was showing the bull calf in the 4-H division. She had brown hair pulled back in a single braid, and she had the kind of face that did not give itself away easily. Walt stood beside her and asked if she needed a hand. She looked at him sideways. She said her brother had it. He stood there anyway. He did not have anything else to say. Eventually, she asked him his name. He told her. She told him hers. They watched the boy show the calf. After the class was over, Walt asked her if he could buy her a hamburger at the food tent. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, yeah. They were married in October of 1988 at St. Mark's Lutheran in Cedar Falls. The church was 3/4 full. Lorene Mae wore her grandmother's wedding dress taken in at the waist. Walt wore the same suit he had worn to his grandmother's funeral 4 years older, now fitting him better. Hap Whitlock stood up as best man. Lorene Mae's father walked her down the aisle. He was a thin, quiet man named Earl Tuthill who had farmed 240 acres in Tama County until 8 years before, until something had happened to him that nobody in the Tuthill family ever talked about above a whisper. That same fall on a Saturday morning in late October, Walt Crandall sold the Loadstar. He sold it to a boy named Trevor Hines. Trevor was 17 years old. He was tall and thin, and he had a bad case of acne and a quiet way about him. His father had been killed 3 months earlier in the only kind of accident. An Iowa farmer is supposed to be afraid of a tractor rollover on a steep slope at the south end of their 110-acre place. Trevor had come out of the funeral the owner of the farm. He was the only child. His mother was a good woman, but she had no head for the equipment side of things. Trevor needed to haul his crop. The boy had asked around. Someone at the elevator had mentioned that Walt Crandall might be willing to sell the Loadstar. Trevor came up the drive on a bicycle. Walt was in the yard checking the air in the back tires. He heard the bike on the gravel. He turned around. The boy got off and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then he said his name. Walt nodded. He said he had heard about Trevor's father. He said he was sorry. The boy nodded back. He said he had come to ask about the truck. Walt walked him over to the Loadstar. The boy looked at it. He ran his hand along the fender where the rust had eaten through, and Walt had cut out the bad metal and welded in a patch and primered it gray. The patch looked like a scar. Walt told him everything about the truck. He told him about the bad water pump and the new water pump. He told him about the timing belt and how to set it. He told him about the way the second gear synchro was a little tired, and you had to double clutch sometimes coming up the hill out of Janesville. He told him every single thing that was wrong with the truck, and every single thing that was right. Then he told him the price, $1,600, the same price Walt had paid for it 4 years earlier. Trevor blinked. He said he could not pay $1,600. He said he could maybe pay $12. Walt shook his head. He said the price was $16. He said the truck was worth that. He said he was not going to take advantage of the boy by giving him a good deal that left the truck weak somewhere in his accounts. He said 16 was what the truck was worth, and Trevor would pay 16, and he would pay it cash. Trevor said he did not have the money. He said he would have to borrow it. Walt looked at him for a long moment. He thought about a kitchen table in October of 1984 and a leather notebook open under a single bulb. He thought about his grandfather's spidery handwriting. Never owe a man his own labor. He thought about Burl Maddox and the way his hand had felt on his shoulder. Walt said no. Walt said the only rule was that the boy could not borrow for it. Walt said he would let the boy work for it. He said Trevor could come over once a week every Saturday for the next 8 months and help Walt with the spring work. He said at the end of 8 months, when the truck was paid off in labor, Walt would sign over the title and the truck would be his, and he would owe no man anything for it. Trevor stared at him. He started to say something. He stopped. He nodded. He shook Walt's hand. The deal was done. Trevor showed up the next Saturday and every Saturday after that for 34 weeks. He fixed fence. He hauled hay. He cleaned out the equipment shed. He learned how to weld. By the time the 8 months were up, he had a truck, and he had the beginnings of an education, and he did not owe a single dollar to anyone. That spring in 1989, on a Thursday evening in late April, Walt sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bank statements and a brochure for a new John Deere 4430 tractor. The 4430 was beautiful. It had 120 horsepower. It had a cab with air conditioning. It had a radio. The dealership in Waverly was offering a deal where a man could put down $10,000 and finance the rest at 9.5% interest over 5 years. The monthly payment came out to $462. Walt ran the numbers. He could afford it. With the Hendricks place coming into full production and the home place running smooth, the payment was nothing. He could pay it in his sleep. He could expand fast. He could buy more land. He could be a real operator. He sat there for an hour with the brochure open in front of him. He felt the pull of it. He felt the seduction of it. The new tractor would do in one pass what the old 806 did in 2. He could farm more ground. He could grow faster. Lorene Mae came in from the back porch. She had been hanging laundry. She set the empty basket down on the counter. She came over and stood behind him and looked over his shoulder at the brochure. She did not say anything at first. She just looked. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at him with the gray-brown eyes he had married her for, and she said his name once quiet, the way she said it when she was about to tell him something that mattered. She said she wanted to tell him about her father. She said her family had farmed 240 acres in Tama County, just outside Traer. She said the land had been in the Tuthill family since 1873. She said her father had farmed it, the way his father had farmed it, with old equipment and slow expansion and money in the bank until 1979. She said in 1979 her father had listened to a man at the implement dealership and a man at the bank, and he had taken out a loan on a new combine and a new tractor and a new grain dryer system. She said the loan had been at 13% interest. She said by 1981, with the farm crisis breaking across Iowa and grain prices in the floor and interest rates climbing to 18%, her father had been unable to make the payments. She said the bank had taken the equipment first and then the land. She said the family had moved into a rented house in Traer. She said in March of 1982, her father had walked out to the rented garage behind the house at 4 in the morning and he had not come back. She said her mother had found him at 6. She said her mother had never been the same. She said she had been 20 years old when it happened. She said she had nursed her mother for 2 years before her mother had died of what the doctors called heart failure, but what Lorene Mae had always called something else. Walt sat very still. Lorene Mae reached across the table. She put her hand on his hand. Her hand was cool and dry and steady. She said she had never told him this before because she had not wanted to put it on him. She said she was telling him now because she needed him to understand something. She said they did not owe a single dollar to anyone for this dirt. She said her grandfather, Lemuel Crandall, had not owed a dollar for this dirt. She said his grandfather Elias had not owed a dollar for this dirt. She said the reason they were sitting at this kitchen table on this evening with their dinner plates already washed was because nobody in the line had ever signed a paper that gave another man permission to take it away from them. She said she would not be the wife of a man who put that at risk for a tractor with air conditioning. She said it without anger. She said it the way a woman says a thing that is simply true. She said, "Don't forget why you started." Walt looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the brochure from the John Deere dealership and he folded it in half. And he folded it in half again, and he stood up and he walked over to the wood stove in the corner of the kitchen. And he opened the door and he put the brochure in and he closed the door, and the brochure burned to a soft black curl in about 30 seconds. He came back and sat down across from her. He took her hand again. He said he was sorry. She shook her head. She said, "Don't be sorry." She said, "Just remember." He nodded. He remembered. He never forgot. From that night forward for the rest of his life, Walter Crandall did not borrow a single dollar to expand his farm. Not for equipment, not for land, not for buildings, not for anything. The phrase Lorene Mae used at the kitchen table that April evening, "Don't forget why you started," would become a kind of prayer he said to himself in dark moments for the next 35 years. Now, have you ever been told you were too much of a risk? By an enemy you could have fought? Or by a kind man with a soft voice who told you he was helping you? It is the second kind that builds a man if he lets it into something the first kind cannot break. Drop a comment if you know what I'm talking about. In the spring of 1992, a man named Lawrence Wexler stopped by the Crandall farm on a Sunday afternoon. Lawrence was 71 years old. He owned 160 acres of good ground that bordered Walt's place on the north. He had farmed it for 44 years. He was retiring. His 3 children, all grown and gone to Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and as far away as Denver, wanted him to sell the land to a developer who was going to put up a subdivision. The developer was offering $4,200 an acre. The Wexler children wanted the money. Lawrence did not want the subdivision, but Lawrence was tired, and his wife had been gone 3 years now, and the children were the children. And a man at 71 does not have the energy for a fight at the dinner table in his own daughter's kitchen. He came to see Walt because he had heard things at the co-op. He had heard that the young Crandall over the fence line paid cash and farmed honest. He had heard that Walt did not borrow. He had come to ask if Walt might be interested in the place. They sat at Walt's kitchen table. Lorene Mae poured them both coffee. Lawrence laid out the situation. He laid out the developer's offer. He said he would sell to Walt instead for the same money on one condition. Walt asked what the condition was. Lawrence Wexler looked at him with the watery blue eyes of a man who had spent 50,000 mornings watching the sunrise come up over his own fields. He said he wanted Walt to promise him that he would never put a house on it. He said he wanted Walt to promise that the dirt would stay dirt. He said he wanted to die knowing that the work he had done for 44 years had not been turned into asphalt by his own children. Walt looked at the old man. He thought about his own grandfather. He thought about the ground his great-grandfather had broken in 1898. He held out his hand. He said he would never build a house on it. He said he would only farm it. Lawrence Wexler shook his hand. He started to cry. He did not wipe at his eyes. He just sat there at Walt's kitchen table and let the tears run down his cheeks and into the coffee, and Lorene Mae quietly got up and went to the back porch so the old man could have his moment. The deal closed 3 weeks later. $312,000 cash. Walt walked out of the closing with the deed to 160 more acres of free and clear ground and a promise he would keep for the rest of his life. By the spring of 1995, Walt was farming 640 acres. The home place, the Hendricks ground, the Wexler ground, a small 40-acre piece he had picked up at a sheriff's sale in 1993. He had 2 hired hands. He had 3 grain bins where he used to have one. He was hauling more corn than the Loadstar would have ever been able to handle, and he had moved through a Ford F700 and a Chevrolet C60 over the years. But in the spring of '95, he bought his first semi. It was a used Peterbilt 379, long nose, red, $42,000 cash. He drove it home from a dealer in Davenport on a sunny morning in March. He pulled into his own driveway with the truck rumbling under him, and he sat in the cab for a moment and listened to the low purr of the Cummins diesel, and he thought of his grandfather, and he thought of Lorene Mae, and he thought of his hands 12 years earlier bleeding in a cold shed, working on a different engine entirely. That same spring, he started doing something he had never done before. He started hauling for other farmers. The first farmer to ask was a young man named Dale Brunner. Dale was 26 years old, and he had inherited his father's small place over by Dunkerton, 200 acres of decent ground, but with the same kind of small auger and slow setup that Walt had once had. Dale had called Burl Maddox first. Burl had given him the same speech he had given Walt 11 years earlier. Not personal, just business. Too much risk. Dale had heard the speech, and a week later at the co-op, somebody had said that Walter Crandall was running a Peterbilt now and might be willing to haul. Dale called Walt that night. Walt said he would do it. Dale asked the price. Walt told him 20 cents a bushel. The going rate, no premium for the slow setup. Dale could not believe it. He asked why. Walt said because somebody had told him no in 1984, and he had not forgotten how that felt. Word spread. By the fall of 1995, Walt was hauling for 9 small farmers around the county. By 1997, he had bought a second Peterbilt. By 1999, he had a third. He had 2 full-time drivers. He hauled for everyone Burl Maddox would not. He charged the going rate. He showed up on time. He never once made a small farmer feel like he was a problem to be managed. By the fall of 2001, Walter Crandall, age 36, owned 1,200 acres of land, free and clear, no mortgage of any kind. He had 3 Peterbilts. He had 2 grain bins he had built that summer, with Lorene Mae's blessing paid for in cash with the previous season's profits. His annual gross had crossed $2 million for the first time. His annual net was just over $600,000. His debt was 0. That same fall, Burl Maddox was 47. He owned 3 trucks. He still owed $212,000 on the newest one. He had refinanced his house in 1998 to put a new roof on it, and to buy out his ex-partner from a small trucking company they had tried to start together in the early 90s. The partnership had not worked. The house refinance was at 7.25%. He had $93,000 left on it. He worked 12-hour days. He hauled for the Pollard operation and for the McAllister brothers and for 2 other big farms. He had a wife now, a quiet woman named Doris, and a 13-year-old son named Bowen, who liked baseball and did not particularly want to ride in the truck with his father on Saturdays. Burl had heard the talk at the co-op for years now. He had heard the name Walter Crandall come up. He never joined the conversations. He just listened. He drove the same county roads. He saw the new bins go up on the Crandall place. He saw the Peterbilts. He saw the way the small farmers around the county talked about Walt, the way men used to talk about their fathers. Once in 1999, he had pulled up to the elevator with a load from Pollard, and he had seen Walt's truck in line ahead of him, and Walt had been standing on the running board with the door open talking to the driver of a beat-up GMC grain truck behind him, and they had been laughing. Walt had been 34 years old, then lean and weathered, the man he was always going to be. Burl had stayed in his cab. He had not waved. The summer of 2005 was the worst summer of Walt Crandall's life. It had nothing to do with the farm. He and Lorene Mae had been trying for years to have a child. Lorene Mae had been told at 37 that it would be difficult. They had tried anyway. In the fall of 2004, when Lorene Mae was 42 and Walt was 39, she had become pregnant. The doctors had been cautious. The pregnancy had been hard. The boy had been born on the 11th of March, 2005, 6 weeks early. They had named him James Elias Crandall. They had brought him home from the hospital after 18 days in the neonatal unit at the University of Iowa hospitals. He had a hole in his heart. 2 holes, actually. The doctors had used technical words. They had said they would watch him. They had said sometimes these things resolved on their own. They had said sometimes they did not. He had lived for 8 months and 4 days. He died in the early morning of November 15th, 2005, in his crib in the upstairs bedroom that had once been Walt's father's. Lorene Mae found him at 5 in the morning. She did not scream. She came down the stairs holding him in her arms, and she walked into the kitchen where Walt was making coffee, and she stood in the doorway. And she did not have to say anything because Walt knew the moment he turned around. They buried him in the cemetery behind St. Mark's, 3 rows down from Elias and Hattie Crandall. The stone was small. It said his name and the dates in 3 words, "Beloved son," briefly. For the next 8 weeks, Lorene Mae did not get out of bed except to eat and to use the bathroom. She did not cry mostly. She just lay there. She had taken a leave from the hospital. The other nurses sent casseroles. Walt put them in the refrigerator and ate 1 or 2 of them and threw the rest out. In the second week of January, on a Tuesday evening, Walt came in from the chores. He took off his coat. He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed where his wife had been lying for almost 3 months. He took her hand. Her hand was thin. Her wrist felt like a bird's wrist. He said her name. He said, "Lorene Mae." She did not look at him. He said he was not going to lose her too. He said he would not be able to bear it. She turned her head on the pillow. She looked at him. He said they had the dirt. He said they had each other. He said they would find another way to leave something behind. She started to cry finally, the way she had not cried at the funeral or any time after. She cried for a long time. He held her. When she was done, she sat up. She wiped her face on his shirt sleeve. She said, "All right." She said she would try. She got up the next morning. She went back to work the following Monday. She did not have another child. They did not try again. The bedroom upstairs that had been the nursery, they closed the door. They did not open it again for 14 years. Walt's younger sister, Annie, lived in Cedar Rapids with her husband, a high school principal named Glenn Pemberton. They had 1 daughter, a small, dark-haired girl named Renly, who everyone called Ren. Wren had been born in October of 1984, just 2 weeks after a Tuesday afternoon. Her uncle Walt had stood in his own driveway and watched a Freightliner pull away in a cloud of dust. Annie used to joke that her brother and her daughter had started their adult lives in the same month. Wren had been visiting the farm in the summers since she was 12. The first summer had been 1996. She had come because her mother was working full-time, and her father had a summer teaching position, and the girl needed a place to be. She had come back every summer after that. Walt had taken her out to the equipment shed on her third day and showed her the 806 tractor and the workbench and the green snap on toolbox his grandfather had used. He let her pick up a wrench. She held it carefully. She asked him what it was for. He told her. By the time she was 14, Walt was teaching her to read his grandfather's notebook. By the time she was 18 and graduating high school in 2002, she had announced to her parents that she was going to study agribusiness at Iowa State. When James died in November of 2005, Wren was 21 years old, a junior in college. She came home for the funeral. She did not say much at the burial, but that Christmas when most college students were going on ski trips with their friends, she came to the farm and stayed for 10 days, and she sat with Lorene Mae through the worst nights. And she asked nothing and offered nothing and was simply there. Walt and Lorene Mae had buried a son who had been built to last 8 months. They were beginning, without quite knowing it, to recognize the heir who had been built to last 50 years. In the fall of 2008, the world fell apart. The collapse started on Wall Street, and it rolled west across the country like a slow, heavy storm. By October, it had reached Black Hawk County. The grain elevator that had served Cedar Falls and the surrounding farms for 80 years had been sold in 2003 to a national conglomerate based in Kansas City. The conglomerate had used the elevator as collateral for further acquisitions in Nebraska and South Dakota. By the time the market seized in September of 2008, the conglomerate was carrying nearly $400 million in debt across its operations. By the second week of November, it had filed for bankruptcy protection. The local elevator went into receivership. Farmers' grain checks were frozen. Payments stopped. The bankruptcy trustee announced that the facility would be sold at auction to satisfy the creditors. The likely buyer was another large conglomerate, this one based in Minneapolis, that was looking to expand its footprint in the eastern Iowa Corn Belt. The town held an emergency meeting in the Cedar Falls High School gymnasium on the third Tuesday of November, 2008. The gym was packed. There were 300 farmers in the bleachers. There were more standing along the walls. The mood was not anger. It was something worse. It was the dull, heavy resignation of men who had been beaten in their own country one too many times in a row. At the long table at the front of the gym, the town council sat with the bankruptcy trustee. Among the council members, in his good shirt and his pressed jeans, 54 years old now and looking 60, was Burl Maddox. Walt Crandall was in the bleachers 3 rows up with Lorene Mae beside him. Wren was 24 years old and home from her job at an agricultural lender in Des Moines for Thanksgiving break, and she was sitting on his other side. The mayor stood up and explained the situation. He said the trustee expected the sale to close before the end of the year. He said he had been told that the Minneapolis buyer was the only serious bidder. He said the bid would likely come in around $8 million, well below the elevator's true value, but that beggars in receivership could not be choosers. He said there was nothing the town could do. The room went very quiet. Walt Crandall stood up. Burl Maddox, sitting at the council table at the front of the gym, looked across the room and saw him. And in that moment, in the long second before Walter Crandall opened his mouth to speak, Burl Maddox felt the floor of the gymnasium shift slightly under his feet. and he understood without yet knowing what was about to be said that the next 30 seconds were going to remake every memory he had of a Tuesday afternoon in October 24 years ago, when he had laid a kind hand on the shoulder of a skinny 19-year-old boy and told him to go and learn his lessons somewhere else. Walt did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stood there in the third row of the bleachers in his work coat and his clean Wrangler jeans, 43 years old. Lean and weathered, the man, 24 years of dirt and patience had built. He spoke just loud enough to carry to the front table. He said he would buy it. The room did not react at first. The words were too small to fit the situation. People turned in their seats slowly, the way a herd of cattle turns when something unexpected has happened. At the far end of the pasture, 300 faces came around to look at him. The mayor at the front table, a man named Patrick Devlin, who had run a hardware store on Main Street for 30 years, blinked at him from across the gym. Devlin asked him to repeat himself. Walt said it again, the same words, the same flat, steady tone. He said he would buy the elevator. Council President Henderson, who sat to the mayor's left, leaned forward into the microphone. Henderson was a real estate attorney in town, a careful man, a man who had spent his life weighing the difference between what people said in rooms like this and what could actually be done. He said Walt's name once gently, the way an adult speaks to a child who has said something earnest but impossible. He said this was a multi-million-dollar transaction. He said the financing alone would take weeks. He said the trustee needed a serious buyer with serious capital, not a goodwill gesture. Walt looked at him. He said he did not need financing. He said he would pay cash. Burl Maddox, sitting at the long council table at the front of the gymnasium, with his hands folded in front of him, felt something inside his chest. Do a thing he did not have a word for. Not panic. Not surprise. Something older than either. Something like the feeling you get when you have been telling yourself a story about your own life for 24 years, and the story turns out to be true in a different way than you had thought. The silence in the gymnasium lasted 30 full seconds. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seat. The big industrial fans in the rafters hummed. Somewhere up in the bleachers, a baby started to cry and was hushed by its mother in a single breath. 300 grown men and women stared at Walter Crandall. And Walter Crandall stood quietly in his row and waited for somebody at the front table to figure out what to do next. Carl Brody, 52 years old, sat in the second row of the bleachers in a green Pioneer seed cap. Carl had $80,000 worth of his fall corn frozen in the elevator's accounts. He had a daughter at the University of Northern Iowa. He had a son who was about to start his freshman year of high school and needed braces. He turned in his seat and looked at Walt the way a drowning man looks at a hand that has been extended over the side of the boat. He did not say anything. He just looked. Esther Mae Pemberton, 67 years old, was a widow. Her husband Roy had died in 2004. She farmed 210 acres herself, with a hired hand on a part-time basis. She had $40,000 frozen at the elevator. That money was the difference that winter between her keeping the farm and putting it on the market in March. She sat very straight in her chair and held her purse on her lap and did not move at all. But her eyes had filled with tears before she had registered that they were filling. Tommy Reynolds, 28 years old in his first year of farming. His late uncle's 80-acre place outside LaPorte City had $12,000 frozen in the elevator's books. $12,000 was the entire net result of his first crop. Tommy had stood up at the back of the gymnasium when the meeting started, and he had been holding his hat in his hands the whole time, and now he sat down slowly on the floor with his back against the painted concrete block wall, the way a man sits down when his legs have stopped working. Henderson looked over at the bankruptcy trustee. a man in a dark suit who had driven up from Des Moines that afternoon. The trustee was looking at Walt with a face that was trying very hard not to show anything at all. The trustee leaned over and whispered something to Henderson. Henderson nodded. He turned back to the room. He said, "Mr. Crandall, are you saying you can produce $8 million in liquid funds?" Walt said yes. Henderson said when. Walt said within 10 business days. Henderson said how. Walt said wire transfer. He said the funds were in money market accounts at 3 different banks. He said he could have the trustee a certified statement by the end of the week. Devlin, the mayor, spoke up then. He said, "Walt, son, are you sure about this?" He said, "This is a lot of money." He said, "The elevator has problems." He said, "This is not going to be a small thing to take on." Walt looked at him. Walt said, "Patrick," he said it the way you say it. "When you have known a man for 20 years. Patrick, the elevator's only problem is that it was bought by people who did not live here." He said, "The building is sound." He said, "The equipment works." He said, "The books are a mess because the conglomerate cooked them, but the underlying business is fine." He said he had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. He said he had walked the facility twice. He said he had had Lorene Mae's cousin, who was a CPA in Cedar Rapids, review the last 4 years of public filings. He said the elevator at $8 million was a bargain. He said at $6 million it was theft. He said he was prepared to offer 8.4 to make the deal close fast and clean. He said he would pay it Friday if the trustee wanted. The room exhaled. It exhaled all at once. 300 farmers letting out the same long breath. And the breath sounded like wind through a windbreak in October. The trustee leaned over and whispered to Henderson again. Henderson nodded. He turned back to the gym. He said the council would call a recess. He said the council would meet privately with Mr. Crandall and the trustee in the principal's office in 15 minutes. He said the meeting would resume at 8 o'clock sharp. Walt sat back down. Lorene Mae took his hand under the bench the way she had taken his hand at the kitchen table the night they had decided not to buy the new tractor in 1989. Wren on his other side stared at her uncle as if she had never seen him before in her life. The deal closed on the 8th of December 2008. $8.4 million wire transfer into the trustee's escrow account on a Friday afternoon. The largest private cash transaction in the recorded history of Black Hawk County. The first thing Walt did at noon on the day after the closing was sit down at the kitchen table in the elevator's main office with a list of every farmer who had been holding grain or had unpaid checks at the time of the receivership. There were 117 names on the list. The total amount frozen was just over $3.1 million. Walt wrote out checks. He did it himself, by hand. He sat there for 2 days with a fountain pen and a checkbook and a list, and when he was done, every farmer who had been hurt by the bankruptcy had been made whole. He paid the difference between what the trustee was offering and what the farmers were actually owed out of his own pocket. He did not announce this to the newspaper. He did not put it on a sign. The farmers got their checks in the mail with no letter and no explanation, and they figured it out themselves. The second thing he did on the following Monday morning was call a meeting of every hauler who currently had contracts with the elevator. There were 11 of them. They came to the conference room at the back of the elevator office at 9 in the morning. They sat in folding chairs. Burl Maddox was one of them. He had to be there. Half his annual income came from elevator contracts. He sat in the back row in a clean Carhartt jacket and a feed cap, and he could not quite bring himself to look directly at the man at the front of the room. Walt stood at the front. He laid out the new operating plan. He said all existing contracts would be honored at their existing rates through the end of the calendar year. He said he would be reviewing rates in January and bringing them up to fair market in line with what other elevators in the region paid. He said he would be implementing a new policy effective immediately called the First Harvest Rule. He said any farmer with under 200 acres and any farmer hauling his or her first ever crop under their own name would receive priority scheduling at the pit. They would be moved to the front of the line. He said this rule would be inviolable. He said any hauler who tried to pressure a small farmer to skip his turn or to defer his slot to a larger operation would have his contract terminated on the spot. He said 2 full-time mechanics would be hired by the elevator effective January 1st. Their job would be exclusively to assist any farmer in Black Hawk County or the surrounding counties whose equipment broke down during planting or harvest. They would charge at cost. No profit, no labor markup. He said he was not running a charity. He said he was running a cooperative the way a cooperative was supposed to be run, which meant the people who used it owned a piece of how it worked. When the meeting was over, the haulers got up to leave. Walt asked Burl to stay behind. The conference room emptied. The other haulers filed out, looking back over their shoulders. The door closed. Walt sat down in one of the folding chairs in the front row. He gestured to the chair across from him. Burl sat down. For a long time, neither man spoke. The afternoon sun came through the conference room window in long, dusty bars. The wall clock ticked. Somewhere out in the pit, a truck was unloading. Burl Maddox cleared his throat. He looked at his hands. The hands were old. The knuckles were thick. They had been gripping a steering wheel for 44 years. He spoke to the floor. He said he had been wrong. He said it quietly. He said he had been thinking about it for years. He said he had known somewhere inside himself. Since at least the summer Walt had bought the second Peterbilt back in the late 90s. He said he had not had the words for it then. He said he had them now. He said back in October of '84, that day at Walt's farm, he had been wrong. He said he should have taken the chance on the kid. He said he was sorry. Walt did not answer right away. He looked at Burl across the small distance between their chairs. He looked at the man who had laid a hand on his shoulder when he was 19 and told him with all the kindness in the world that he was not worth the trouble. When Walt finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was the voice of a man who had spent 24 years thinking about exactly this conversation and had decided long ago what he was going to say. He said, "No, Burl." He said, "You weren't wrong." Burl looked up. His face was confused. He had prepared himself for many things. He had prepared himself for cold formality. He had prepared himself for measured forgiveness. He had even prepared himself for anger for the long-delayed bill come due. He had not prepared himself for this. Walt continued. He said you made a good business decision that day. He said you looked at the situation. You assessed the risk. You made the rational choice to protect your own bottom line. He said there was no shame in that. He said any reasonable man in your position would have made the same call. He paused. He leaned forward slightly. His elbows rested on his knees. He said, "But here is the thing, Burl." He said you saw a kid that day. You did not see the dirt under his boots. You saw a problem. You did not see a promise. You saw a slow auger and a small grain cart and a boy who looked 16, and you did the math on what that was worth to you that afternoon. And you were right. That afternoon, that boy was not worth your trouble. He said your good business decision forced me to make a better one, not for one day's profit, for the next 40 years. He said it forced me to drive 200 miles south to an auction lot the next morning, with every dollar to my name in my coat pocket. It forced me to spend a winter in a freezing shed, teaching myself to rebuild a Continental engine out of a manual I bought from a parts house in Des Moines. He said it forced me to learn at 19 years old that the only person I could ever truly count on was myself. That dependency was a cage. That kindness from a man who controlled my future was just another kind of leash. He said, in a way, "Burl, I should probably thank you." He said that was a lesson worth more than any hauling fee you would have charged me that fall. He said you taught it to me by being honest about what I was worth to you in October of 1984. And he said that honesty that day 24 years ago was the foundation that everything I have built since has been built on. He said, "So, no, Burl. You weren't wrong. You did exactly what you should have done." He said the only difference between us is that I learned something from it. And as far as I can tell, you spent the next 24 years trying not to. He said it without heat. He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. Burl Maddox sat in this folding chair across from him, and for the first time in his adult life, he understood what it felt like to be seen completely by another human being and to have nowhere to hide. He could not look at Walt. He looked at his hands. He looked at the floor. He could not speak. After a long minute, Walt stood up. He put his hand on Burl's shoulder. He let it rest there for a moment. Then he walked out of the conference room, and he did not look back. That moment, that hand on the shoulder would stay with Burl Maddox for the rest of his life. He understood it for what it was. It was not forgiveness. Walt had nothing to forgive him for in the strict accounting of things. The hand on the shoulder was something else. It was the same gesture Burl himself had made 24 years earlier in the dust of a young man's driveway. It was the hand of a man who had something the other man did not, and who had chosen to extend it gently in the full awareness of what the gesture cost. Walt had given it back to him. Walt had given Burl back his own kindness exactly as it had been delivered, and let him sit with it. In the spring of 2009, the elevator was rebranded. The big metal sign at the entrance came down on a Saturday morning in March. A new sign went up in its place by Monday afternoon. Crandall Grain Cooperative. Below the name in smaller letters were 3 words: owned by farmers. The first harvest rule went into effect on the 1st of January. The 2 full-time mechanics, both retired dieselmen from the John Deere implement shop in Waterloo, started work the same week. Walt set up a scholarship fund through a trust at the First National Bank of Black Hawk County. The trust was endowed with $2 million of his own money and was structured to grow and fund itself in perpetuity. The scholarship was for any student from a farm family in Black Hawk or the 4 surrounding counties who wanted to study a trade: diesel mechanics, welding, agribusiness, veterinary technology. The trust paid full tuition and books at any accredited program in the state of Iowa. The scholarship was named the Burl Maddox Good Business Scholarship. Burl heard about the name from his wife Doris, who had read it in the Cedar Falls Reporter. Doris brought the paper to him at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning in February. She put it down beside his coffee cup. She did not say anything. He read the article. He read it twice. He set down the paper. He sat very still. He stared out the kitchen window at the snow on the back lawn. Doris asked him if he was all right. He nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He got up from the table. He went out to the garage and stood there for almost an hour with his hands in his pockets, just looking at the concrete floor. He understood that the naming of the scholarship was not a mockery. He understood that Walt was incapable of mockery. The naming was something else. It was the same thing as the hand on the shoulder. It was Walt giving Burl back his own life as a kind of teaching. The scholarship was not named for Burl as an honor. It was named for Burl as a reminder. To the kids who would receive it, to the parents who would read about it in the paper, to Burl himself every time he saw the listing in the program at the high school awards night. A reminder that good business and good community were the same thing. A reminder that a smart decision made coldly could echo for 40 years in the lives of strangers. A reminder that the cheapest mistake a man could ever make was to mistake his own convenience for wisdom. Burl Maddox kept hauling. He had no choice. He needed the work. He drove for the cooperative for the next 16 years. He never missed a day. He never asked for a special favor. He never spoke about Walt to anyone, not even to Doris, who eventually stopped asking. He drove the same route between the Pollard place and the elevator that he had been driving since Walt had been a kid in a dusty driveway. And every time he pulled onto the inbound scale, and a young woman handed him a ticket with the name Crandall printed at the top, he felt the same small, private weight in his chest, and he learned to carry it. In the summer of 2019, Doris Maddox was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The treatment was aggressive. She took it for 16 months. She died on the 14th of November 2020. She was 64 years old. They had been married for 39 years. Burl was 66. He buried her at the Lutheran Cemetery in Waverly next to a plot he had bought for himself the same week. He came home from the funeral, and he sat in his recliner for 2 days without speaking. And on the third morning, he put on his work clothes and he drove to the elevator, and he asked to be put back on the schedule. His son, Bowen, by then a 32-year-old man, had quit driving for his father's small operation 10 years earlier. Bowen had gone to college. He had become a high school agriculture teacher in Waterloo. He taught at East High. The kids called him Mr. Maddox. He was a good teacher. He used the Crandall story sometimes in his classroom in the early sessions on agricultural economics when he wanted to explain the difference between leverage and ownership, between fast growth and durable growth, between the kind of decisions that paid off in a quarter and the kind that paid off in a generation. The kids did not know that the Burl in the story was their teacher's father. He never told them. Walt Crandall, by then in his late 50s, did not tell them either on the few occasions he came as a guest speaker. The story, by the time Bowen Maddox was telling it in a high school classroom in Waterloo in 2020, had passed beyond either of the men who had lived it. It had become something else. It had become a way of teaching young people what it cost to have a country in which a man could be too much of a risk. Lorene Crandall had graduated from Iowa State University with honors in agribusiness in May of 2006. She had taken a position with an agricultural lender in Des Moines after college, learning the financing side of farming from the inside, the better to understand what Walt's whole life had been a refusal of. In the fall of 2010, when she was 26, she came back to Black Hawk County for good. She took a low-level position in the office of the Crandall Grain Cooperative, the position any new hire would have taken, and she worked her way up. By 2015, she was the assistant manager. By 2020, she was the general manager. Walt, in his mid-50s, had begun to step back. He still came to the office most days. He still walked the pit in his work boots and his winter coat. He still knew every man and woman who worked for him by name. But the operational decisions had passed to Wren, and she ran the place the way her uncle had taught her, with the first harvest rule still in place, and the 2 mechanics still on staff, and the scholarship fund still growing. In the spring of 2024, Walt Crandall turned 59. He was lean. He was weathered. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but had not yet begun to recede. Lorene Mae was 62. She had retired from nursing in 2016. She kept a vegetable garden behind the farmhouse that took up most of her summers. She and Walt had been married for 36 years. They had buried one son and raised in their own quiet way a niece who was now 39 years old and ran the largest grain cooperative in the eastern part of the state. The original International Loadstar 1600 had been retired in 2004. Trevor Hines, by then in his late 30s with 3 kids and 140 acres of his own, had bought a newer truck and had asked Walt if he wanted the old Loadstar back. Walt had taken it. He had paid Trevor the full going rate for it. He had driven it back to the home place and parked it in the equipment shed. The same shed he had rebuilt the engine in during the winter of 1984. The truck had sat there for 2 years. Then, in the summer of 2007, Walt had spent 6 weeks pulling the steering wheel off, building a wooden mount for it, mounting it on a plank of barnwood from the shed his great-grandfather had built in 1922. He had hung it on the wall of the new office at the elevator the same day the new sign went up out front. Below the steering wheel, mounted on a small brass plate, were 9 words. "You don't need permission to haul your own harvest." That was where the wheel had been ever since. In October of 2024, on a Tuesday afternoon, Burl Maddox pulled his Peterbilt 389 onto the inbound scale at the Crandall Grain Cooperative for what would turn out to be the last delivery of his career. He was 70 years old. He had filed his retirement papers the previous Friday. The next driver had been hired. He had 2 weeks left on the schedule before he handed over the keys. Lorene Crandall, 39 years old, with her dark hair pulled back in a single braid, the way her aunt had worn it in her wedding photograph, slid open the window of the scale house. She handed him the ticket. She smiled at him the same smile she had been giving him for 14 years. The smile that did not know what it was for. Because Walt had never told her, and Lorene Mae had never told her, and Burl had never told her. He took the ticket. He looked at the name at the top. He felt, as he had felt every time for the last 14 years, the small private weight settle in his chest. He looked past Wren into the office. He looked at the wall. The Loadstar steering wheel hung where it always hung. The brass plate beneath it caught the afternoon sun. He sat in the cab for a moment longer than he usually did. Wren tilted her head. She asked him if everything was all right. He said it was. He said it was just a long memory. He said the same thing he always said. But that night, after he dropped his last load and pulled the Peterbilt into the yard at home and walked through his empty kitchen and stood at the counter eating a sandwich over the sink, he found himself driving back to the elevator. He did not plan it. He just got in his pickup truck after dark and drove the 8 miles back into Cedar Falls, and he parked in the gravel lot beside the office, and he sat there for almost an hour looking at the dark windows of the building. He saw a light come on in the office. The cleaning crew had finished an hour ago. It was Wren. She was working late. She did this sometimes. He could see her through the front window, sitting at the desk under the steering wheel, her head bent over a stack of paperwork. He got out of his truck. He walked across the gravel. He knocked on the front door. She looked up. She came over and unlocked the door. She let him in. She did not look surprised. She had seen enough men come back to this office at odd hours over the years that very little surprised her about her uncle's elevator anymore. She asked him if he wanted a cup of coffee. He said yes. She poured him one from the pot on the back counter, the same pot the office staff kept full all day. He took it black. He stood in front of the steering wheel and he looked at the brass plate. She watched him. After a long time, he spoke. He did not look at her. He spoke to the wheel. He said, "Your uncle was right, you know." He said back when he told me I wasn't wrong. He said he wasn't being kind when he said it. He was being honest. He said that's worse. Wren stood quietly behind him. She held her own coffee mug in both hands. The office was warm. The wall clock ticked. She said her uncle thought about that night a lot. The night Burl had said no. She said he kept a notebook. The same kind of notebook her great-great-grandfather Elias had kept, the leather one, with the cracked spine that was now in a glass display case in the corner of the office. She said her uncle had kept his own notebook for 40 years. She said he wrote in it sometimes. She said he wrote Burl a letter every year. On the anniversary, the 8th of October, she said he never sent any of them. She said they were all still in the notebook. Burl Maddox closed his eyes. He stood there with his hand on the brass plate beneath the steering wheel of an old International Loadstar. He had once refused to make irrelevant, and he understood that he had been a part of another man's discipline for 40 years without ever knowing it. He understood that Walter Crandall had not built a 4,000-acre operation and a cooperative that fed half of eastern Iowa out of revenge. He had built it because Burl had given him the only gift Burl had been capable of giving on a dusty afternoon in October of 1984. And Walt had been wise enough at 19 years old to recognize the gift for what it was and put it to work. He understood finally why the scholarship had his name on it. It was not because Walt had wanted to humble him. It was because Walt had wanted to thank him in the only way a careful man knows how to thank another man for a wound that has shaped him. Burl set down his coffee mug on the desk. He turned around. He looked at Wren. He said, "Tell your uncle I said thank you." He said, "Tell him I finally understand." He said, "Tell him I'm sorry it took 40 years." Wren nodded slowly. She said she would tell him. Burl walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold. He turned back. He said one more thing. He said, "Tell him to keep the letters." He said, "Tell him not to send them." He said, "The letters belong to him. They are not for me to read. They are the record of what he did with what I gave him." He walked out into the dark. He drove home. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. Then he went into the small room at the back of the house that had been Doris's sewing room. And he opened the closet, and he pulled out an old photo album, and he sat on the floor with it on his lap. And he turned the pages until he came to a photograph from 1984 of a young man with a clean Freightliner cabover behind him, smiling at the camera with all the confident certainty of a man on the rise. He looked at the young man for a long time. He closed the album. He went to bed. The next morning, he got up early and he drove the Peterbilt to the elevator one more time, and he ran his last day on the schedule, and he turned in his keys at 4 in the afternoon. Wren was at the desk. He shook her hand. He drove home. The most dangerous word in the English language is not no. It is not I hate you. It is not you are a fool. The most dangerous word is the word delivered by a kind man with a hand on your shoulder who tells you he is helping you, that you are not yet enough, that the world is too hard for what you are, that it is time to learn your lesson and be smaller. That word builds the highest walls. It builds them with a soft tone and a fatherly smile. It tells you your limits in a voice that means you no harm. And the only way a young man can ever climb out from under that word is to take the long, slow, patient way out with his own 2 hands in the cold and the dark and the silence for as long as it takes. Walter Crandall took 40 years. He spent 1,400 days of those 40 years standing at workbenches with cut hands. He spent 10,000 mornings checking grain bins and walking fence lines. He spent 36 years coming home at night to the same woman who had known what 19% interest could do to a family before he had, and who had pulled him back from the edge of the same cliff her own father had fallen from. He spent 8 months and 4 days holding a son who had not been built to last. He spent 28 years quietly raising a niece who was in the end the heir his blood had not been able to give him. He spent 24 years between October of 1984 and November of 2008 working quietly and patiently while a kind man drove past his fields in a clean Freightliner and never quite understood what was being built behind the windbreak. And on a Tuesday night in October of 2024, in a warm office in Cedar Falls, an old man stood in front of a steering wheel from a 1968 International Loadstar, and he understood at long last that the kid he had thought was too much of a risk had been the only safe thing in the room that day, and he had simply not had the eyes to see it. Right now, somewhere in this country, a young person is being told they are too much of a risk. Somewhere, a banker is shaking his head. Somewhere, a hauler is driving away in a cloud of dust. Somewhere, a kind voice is saying it is not personal. It is just business. You are just a kid. This is one of those lessons. Somewhere, a 19-year-old is standing in an empty driveway with a full crop and an empty wallet and a future that looks impossible. If you know that young person, send them this story. Tell them the dirt is enough. Tell them they do not need permission to haul their own harvest. Tell them the kindest cuts go the deepest, but they also go the truest. And the man who survives them, who builds his life out of the long quiet, refusal to need anyone's blessing, ends up owning the elevator the kind man delivers to. Tell them their grandfather was right. Tell them to write it down. Tell them to keep the notebook. And tell them one more thing. Tell them that 40 years from now, when everything they are about to start tonight is finished, the kind man who closed the gate on them will come back. He will come back smaller and older, and less certain than he was when he walked away. And he will stand in front of whatever they have built, and he will see it finally for what it is. And the only thing left to do in that moment will be to put a hand on his shoulder and let him sit with it and walk away without saying a word. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet work and loud results. There are still so many harvests to bring in.